TBRC stands for the Tibetan Buddhist Resource Center. TBRC was founded in 1999 by Gene Smith. TBRC's mission is to seek out, preserve, organize, and disseminate Tibetan literature. This is a photo of Gene Smith, the founder of TBRC. In the course of his life, Gene met, in 1960, Deshen Rinpoche. Deshen Rinpoche was one of the first Tibetan lamas to come live in the US, and Gene learned Tibetan from him.
Early on, one of the really important things about Gene is that his teacher was one of the most knowledgeable Tibetan scholars in the Tibetan world in the 20th century. That started Gene off on a path where he quickly knew more about Tibetan literature and Tibetan history than certainly any other non-Tibetan person, and actually more than the large majority of Tibetan people as well.
Deshen Rinpoche wrote a letter of introduction to great lamas like Dilga Khyentse Rinpoche, and this gave Gene, in 1965 when he went to Delhi, India, the chance to connect with all of these great teachers.
In Tibet, all the texts are either manuscripts or wooden block prints. About 100,000 Tibetan refugees came into India, but only brought one copy of this text, one copy of that text. It was very hard to perform a ceremony together because there's no books to study, to learn, to teach. Now, fortunately, this guy appeared at the scene, and his name was Gene.
And over the next couple of years, he realized that there were hardly any texts that he could find. So he got very interested in this problem and trying to figure out how to solve this problem. And in 1967, he joined the Library of Congress as a field rep. At that point, the US government had about 10% of the Indian currency in circulation, and they could use it for humanitarian purposes. Gene had this incredible idea to use it to sponsor the publication of a Tibetan text. And this program went on for years, nearly 20 years, and Gene did the whole thing, republished thousands of volumes, and in that way was single-handedly responsible in many ways for saving Tibetan literature. It's an incredible story.
So he was collecting them on the ground. Later on, when the age of computers dawned, he started understanding information technology. He realized that he could start getting digitalized images of these works that he had already helped to print and get them available on the World Wide Web.
The basic process is to bring a text, and we'll catalog it first. And so we have the full bibliographic record, and then we'll scan it, and it will then be processed and entered into the archive. But not merely for archival purposes, right? Not merely to create a sort of big black box of Tibetan literature, but for the sake of its accessibility.
TBRC is one of the world's largest digital libraries with direct access to the source text image. So it's not just a catalog, you can actually get the underlying text image right away. And for that, it's a really unique and rare resource.
This literature is one of the great literatures of Asia, one of the great literatures of the world. So with the preservation of all this stuff in digital form, and now the possibility to search its contents, is absolutely an enormous boon for anyone who's interested in studying anything about Tibet.
Tibetan literature has been split up and spread apart after '59 throughout the world. And our goal now is really to use the digital technology to bring it back together.
Right now we're sort of funded as a project for a Gene Smith project, but we're switching into becoming an institution for the long haul, to go out and find texts in Mongolia, Russia, Bhutan, Tibet, India, Nepal, all through the Himalayas, and even in research libraries all across the world.
Well, the future is very much to enable other organizations and other languages to be preserved in the same way.
These languages are not just the language themselves, but they carry wisdom. It's very, very important to preserve that, and then to use the database structure that Gene envisioned. I'm sure it'll be tweaked for each tradition in different times and places, and really just keep these cultural jewels of humanity alive. The entire TBRC library, if we boil it down into an ebook format, is about 1 terabyte. Now imagine if we could get thousands of these drives all across the world, to all the Tibetan monasteries in the Himalayas, everywhere. And imagine if people could then replicate these drives, print from these drives. I mean, it would bring Tibetan literature just like that at a far greater level than it ever previously existed across the world.
So that means these 1,000-year-old or maybe 2,000-year-old texts, literatures will survive forever. And if that's so, that is an amazing service for, of course, Tibetan literature, but also, for the humanity.
We have to make a decision ourselves what we're going to keep for the future, because 200 years from now, 400 years from now, 1,000 years from now, people will look back and say, they made a difference. They saved a lot of the world's cultural gems, and we're benefiting from that now.